Energy, without a doubt the worst stat in Diablo 2. It doesn't help you equip your gear, it doesn't make you tankier, and it doesn't increase your damage. It only gives you more mana, and while that is useful to keep casting spells, mana potions are cheap and in infinite supply. I will try to beat Diablo 2 with a new character through all 3 difficulties while assigning every single stat point into energy. And there's a reason I saved this stat for last, because all-out energy maxing has lots of downsides and very little upside. Since energy gives you mana, it made sense to go with a mage class. The sorceress would be my number one choice for this, since she has a skill called Energy Shield, which can actually be useful with a big mana pool. But I picked the necromancer. I simply wanted to play a necro. I really like the class, but I haven't played it in a long time. The necromancer starts the game with a wand with +1 to raise skeleton, a skeleton summon to aid me in battle. Me and my minion fought monsters in the Bloodmoor until I gained enough experience to hit level 2. The necromancer starts with 15 strength, which is not a lot, barely enough to equip the lowest tier of light armor, decently high starting dexterity, though that's not gonna be too useful to me, 15 vitality and 45 life, also not a lot, though you might notice that my life total was 46 when I hit level 2. The necromancer gets 1.5 additional life per level, so my life pool will increase as I level up, only at a very slow rate. And then 25 energy, where all future stats would go to keep growing that mana pool. As for skills, the summoning tree is a strong and safe playstyle, but to maximize the usefulness of my mana I decided to go for the more spammable bone spells, starting with Teeth, which fires long-range projectiles dealing magic damage to enemies. A decent spell for attacking several enemies at a time, though the damage of each individual projectile is not great. But for the early game it was totally acceptable, and I sprayed my enemies down with a barrage of teeth, supplemented with the occasional bonk from my wand. I cleared out the Den of Evil for the first quest of Act 1, and I reached level 4 in the process. For the early levels my build progression was simple, stats went into energy and skill points went into teeth. When turning in the first quest for the free skill point reward, I window shopped at Akara for a new wand, though with my humble net worth I was not able to afford a new weapon yet. But buying wands from merchants would have big potential for this character. Teeth gets one more projectile per skill level, so it quickly turned into a formidable spell for clearing out large groups of trash mobs. The damage against single targets was not as impressive though. I had to be really careful around elite enemies. When fighting Rakanishu in the stony field, I narrowly escaped with 2 life remaining. A reminder that while my decent damage output could carry me through the early game, I still had to pay attention to what I was fighting and not get overly confident. And this would turn out to be a bit of a theme for this run. Are you interested in learning a valuable and marketable skill? This video sponsor, Boot.dev, offers a self-paced online course to learn backend development from scratch. Bored learners quit, and that's what's so special about Boot.dev, because they've really put a lot of effort into making their courses and their website fun and engaging. You have game mechanics like earning XP and achievements, streaks and leaderboards, community events, and more. And this philosophy does not end with how the material is packaged. Call me a big old nerd, because I am, but I find it so engaging that even the lessons tip their hat to fantasy and gaming culture. Writing a function that adds 3 numerical values together, that feels like homework. Writing a function to calculate the total damage of a 3-hit sword combo, sign me up. If you get stuck on an assignment, there are several resources to guide you towards the solution, like Boots, a Bear Wizard AI that has been specifically trained on the lessons who can look at your code and nudge you in the right direction. If that sounds interesting, head to boot.dev to check it out, and if you use my promo code SARFEN, you get 25% off your first entire year of the annual plan. A big thanks to boot.dev for sponsoring this video. After a bit more progress and a lot more loot collected and sold for gold, I was finally able to buy a wand from Akara, +2 to teeth. Though this replaced my starting wand, so I had to say farewell to my skeleton friend, who had been my loyal servant from the very start. I guess that sometimes the price of progress is leaving your friends behind. The extra levels in Teeth were very nice, but I did miss having a meat shield to draw the attention of charging enemies, and as I spent a minute running away from Treehead Woodfist, I decided it was time to spread out my skill point investment a little bit. As I hit level 6, I put a skill point into Bone Armor, a shield which absorbs a decent amount of damage completely. The skill description says it absorbs melee damage, which is not quite correct. The shield in fact absorbs physical damage, regardless if it's ranged or melee, and it only absorbs physical damage. Melee elemental attacks aren't absorbed. Still, a very useful skill, which with a bit of an investment could protect my Necromancer from one of 6 damage types in the game completely. I also put a skill point into Clay Golem to get another minion to tank for me. It's not the best summon in the game, but it is a decent meat shield with limited skill points invested. Then I reached the Forgotten Tower, a place frequently featured in my challenges, because the rune drops from the countess in the tower can be used to create some very useful rune words, but this time I did not go in. When it comes to spellcasters especially, some of the easy to make rune words like Stealth and Spirit are simply the best option available 9 times out of 10, and you can farm those runes very reliably. And since my last video was a rune words only run, I decided to ban rune words entirely for this character. Skipping rune words was definitely making this run a lot harder, but also a lot more interesting in terms of gearing up. Though I made this decision at the very start, so we'll see how I feel about it as I enter the later difficulties. I rescued the Kirkane from captivity in what little remained of Tristram, and as my mana pool and number of teeth grew with every level, I started to clear my way through Act 1 quickly, though as I soon after entered the barracks and encountered more ranged enemies, as well as strong individual enemies like the Smith, my life pool started taking some heavy abuse. I was already getting very skewed towards a glass cannon style character, lots of damage from my spells and plenty of mana to support spamming them, but also paper thin defenses, though I guess this was destined to happen from the very start under these character restrictions. Without investing any additional points into vitality, my life pool had only grown by a measly 15 life points from when I started at level 1. After the smith proved to me that clay is not the most durable material, I decided to spend one more skill point towards making my clay golem stronger, with a point in golem mastery. I had a hard time deciding whether I should go for a stronger tank or more teeth damage next, but at level 12 I had also unlocked another bone skill, Bone Wall, and began putting skill points into that skill for the next few levels, but not as a skill to use. You see, Bone Wall is a synergy for both teeth and bone armor, meaning that skill points invested in Bone Wall increased both my damage and my protection against physical damage. This was a compromise, but I preferred this way to spending more points into teeth, as teeth was not going to be my main skill for the long term, and investing even more points into clay golem didn't feel like a great idea either. In the inner cloister I found a magic grand charm, and you can tell I didn't think much of it at first before my brain caught up. 14 life on a grand charm is not something I would use on most characters, but for this character, dedicating 3 inventory spaces for 14 extra life, an increase of over 20% at my current level, that was a no-brainer. Nearing the end of Act 1 in the Catacombs level 2, I found my first piece of noteworthy loot with this green set buckler, Azorus Iron Fist. This shield has plus 10 to strength, a big deal compared to my 50 in natural strength. This could open up a lot more gear options in the future, but using a shield like this also had a big opportunity cost, because the Necromancer's class specific item also goes into the shield slot. For now I was happy to use it though over anything else that I had available to me at the time. Shortly after, I reached the bottom of the catacombs and the first act boss, Andariel. She was certainly a threat to my life pool of 80, with her bonus damage to summon minions making short work of the clay golem, and her poison going straight through my bone armor, but with a ranged attack in teeth, some health potions to counteract the poison, and some cheesy hit and run tactics, I was able to stay alive and chip away at her health bar. This fight ended up being not at all as bad as I had imagined beforehand, and I was able to defeat Andariel without too much trouble. She dropped a few rare items which weren't useful to me other than to sell for gold. I defeated Act 1 at level 15, with 95 energy and a mana pool of 193. Teeth dealt 16 to 20 damage now, which was honestly a little bit weak, considering I had invested almost all of my skill points into making it stronger. I had no curses at all and only 2 points worth of clay golem in the summoning tree. I moved on to the deserts of Act 2, and it would not be a Sarfen video if I didn't start by shopping for Magic Find gloves and boots. And I found a really nice pair of gloves with high Magic Find and a decent bit of fire resistance on top. I could see myself wearing those for a long time. I also picked up a pair of boots for another 20 MF, and together with some topazes in my helm, I managed to reach 59 increased Magic Find already at the start of Act 2. I essentially sacrificed 3 of my gear slots for this, apart from the fire resistance on the gloves I guess, but hopefully this investment would lead to more rare loot to set me up for the future, and it wasn't like the rest of my gear was amazing anyway this early on, so the sacrifice wasn't that big. And then shortly after in the sewers under the city, I reached level 16 and the milestone of 100 energy. Woohoo! I finished up my trip to the sewers by taking down Radamant for the Book of Skill, a free skill point to keep powering up my spell so I could squeeze a little bit more damage out of my mana pool. And then I decided to grab my first mercenary, and as I like to do on this channel, I picked Emilio. But this time not only for the name, but he also had the aura that I wanted, for a bit of passive healing for the entire squad. I set Emilio up with some store-bought starter equipment, a spear with lifesteal, which really goes a long way in keeping melee mercenaries alive, a body armor with a chance to cast Frost Nova when hit, occasionally slowing enemies around him down with cold damage for a nice, unreliable, poor man's crowd control, and to round out his loadout, a random helm with reduced poison length. Nothing too impressive with this gear, but it wasn't meant to be a killing machine, but rather a distraction alongside my clay golem, while I took care of the damage dealing from the comfort of the back row. I grabbed the Horadric cube from the Halls of the Dead, hitting level 17 in the process. I was cruising on through the desert, but there was one glaring weakness in my defenses: elemental damage. Bone armor does nothing against non-physical damage, and since elemental damage often comes in the form of projectiles or long-range spells, and in the case of the lightning beetles in the desert, a volley of teeth could release a sea of lightning heading my way. For now, beetles were the odd one out, but as I went deeper into the game, elemental damage would become more and more common, and I did not have any real plan for how to deal with that, as elemental resistances only gets you so far with a low life pool. Teeth, which I had used ever since level 1, had served me very well so far. Even in the Maggot Lair it was quite useful, as the projectiles that do not hit the first target just passed through and hit enemies behind the first one, almost like a piercing attack. But speaking of piercing attacks, in the Maggot Lair I reached level 18 and unlocked my next damage dealing bone spell, Bone Spear. This spell shoots a bone in a straight line, dealing magic damage to any enemy it hits, and it can pierce through any number of enemies. The damage is really good too, and already at level 1 it did almost double the damage of my level 9 teeth. In wide open areas it didn't have as good coverage due to being a single projectile, but overall a major upgrade to my bone slinging. This is the true weapon of choice for a bone necromancer. Bone Spear fit perfectly with the long narrow corridors of the Maggot Lair, making enemies line up perfectly. I quickly made my way through the rest of the cave, picked up the Horadric staff and escaped with a single HP left while being poisoned. Now that I was mainly using Bone Spear instead of teeth, I wanted to buy another wand, but with a deja vu to when I first tried shopping from Akara, I could not afford the wands I wanted to buy, with a non-magic wand with +2 to Bone Spear having a retail price of 54,000, more than double my total savings. I tried bartering with Drognan to see if he could hook me up with a discount, but no luck. Moving on towards the final quest item that I needed to collect from Act 2, I went into the Claw Viper Temple. I took down Fangskin, the elite snake guarding the Claw Viper amulet, and he dropped a rare ring. Now this was a really solid ring and I want to talk about the stats, but first I just want to highlight that it was called Viper Circle, the perfect name for a ring found from Fangskin in the Claw Viper Temple. Life, life regen and dual resistances, exactly what a fragile character is looking for. Except for the fire resistance, the stat rolls were a bit on the low side, but still a very solid ring, especially compared to the stuff I was wearing at the time. I was prepared for the final stretch of the second act, but I was still thinking about that wand upgrade. I was still not able to afford one, but then I remembered the Horadric cube. I bought a cheap magic wand from Drognan, and by putting that in the cube together with 3 chipped gems, I could reroll the stats on the wand, hoping to get lucky. Now, I would really need to get lucky to get exactly what I wanted, and I ended up walking away without a wand upgrade, but my final roll with my last gems did get +3 to Poison Explosion, another level 18 Poison and Bone skill that sits right next to Bone Spear in the skill tree, so this gamble definitely had the potential to get me what I wanted. On to the Arcane Sanctuary next, a bizarre place, but much like the Maggot Lair, it was as if they made this map with Bone Spear in mind, with long, narrow platforms. On my way through I found the first unique of the round. Unfortunately it was an axe, which would not be useful for a spellslinger like myself. I would have left it on the ground, but I decided to identify it for the video for those who might not know Diablo 2's hundreds of uniques by heart. And it turns out that I'm one of those people, because this has 4 mana after each kill and I had no idea about that. A pretty decent stat for a spell spammer and definitely something I would use. But then I had my first painful interaction with the stat restriction, leaving me with low strength, because despite wearing Hussar's shield for the 10 extra strength, I was still 7 short of equipping the axe. Not a big loss in the grand scheme of things, it was only 4 mana after each kill after all, but I was going to start seeing more and more good loot that I was too weak to wear from this point forward. I took down the summoner by accident when targeting a ghost in front of him. I barely noticed until he fell to the floor, but as I went through the portal to the Canyon of the Magi, I was approaching the second act boss, Duriel, and as a weak spellcaster with less than 100 life, Duriel was going to be a problem. On my way through Talrasha's tomb, I leveled up to level 20, put my third skill point into Bone Spear for 67 to 84 magic damage. Duriel made short work of Emilio and then took my clay golem down in a single hit. I started running and tried to kite him around the tiny pit, but against Holy Freeze it was hard to get shots off without taking heavy damage. I started to panic. I couldn't decide if I should try to summon my golem again to distract him and keep fighting, or if I should try to escape to town via a town portal. So I did neither, and eventually Duriel caught up to me and took me out. Bone Armor and my minions had done a good job of covering up my weaknesses so far, but Duriel exposed them for what they really were. I returned for round 2 after a long walk back from town. This attempt started off in the same way, and even though I was much quicker with the healing potions on Emilio this time, my minions could just not stand their ground. But on the walk back from town, I had an idea. Bone Wall. The skill which I had so far only used as a synergy is also a very spammable obstacle, creating a wall of bones that can really screw with melee monsters. This seemed to be working great, as I had plenty of space to shoot spears at Duriel while he was busy with my walls. But then Duriel chased me into a corner, and the downside with Bone Wall is the Necromancer is also blocked by them, and as I didn't have much experience with using this skill, I went for quantity over precision and filled the room with walls. But with every wall Duriel took down, he inched closer and closer toward me, and I had nowhere to escape. I had gotten his health bar down to the last bit, but he was closing in rapidly. First, he got close enough to me that I started taking tick damage from his aura, and soon he was knocking down the final few walls. All I could do now was to try and raise his damage with my own, and hope that I could take him down before he got to me. When Duriel finally reached me, I drank my final health potion from my belt, and dropping down to literally 1 life, I defeated Duriel in the very last moment. Wow, what a fight. The ending couldn't have been any closer. Bone Wall really came in clutch in that fight, and it is a very useful spell that can really screw with some enemies. But somewhat surprisingly, I kind of forgot about Bone Wall after this and reverted back to relying solely on Bone Armor and my minions as I went into the 3rd act. Early in the jungle I found the Jade figurine, and after engaging in some old-fashioned item trading with NPCs in the town of Act 3, I got the Potion of Life from Alcor. This potion grants 20 extra life permanently, and usually this is not that big of a deal. In fact, for most of the runs I don't even mention it in the video, but this time 20 life was more than a 20% increase to my total, permanently, for free. A major improvement for my character, relatively speaking. I kept rolling once in the cube as new chip gems dropped, with no success. I found a rare amulet, and for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about what if this rolled poison and bone skills instead of war price, even though that makes little sense. The rest of the stats were pretty poor, but I decided to use it anyway for the life regen, because my old amulet was even worse. I got another rare ring from Ormus as a reward for a side quest, but he told me this. And I believe it. It was barely a rare. 3 stats in total, with one of them being 6 mana and one being 11 stamina. Thanks Ormus. My wand cubing hadn't gotten me what I was looking for, so later in the act I went wand shopping again, this time with over 70,000 gold. I still found no wands with +2 bone spear that I could afford, but I did pick up this one for a steal at 13k. 20 FCR and 3 mana after each kill, and since this was my first bit of increased cost speed, it made a noticeable difference in my spell spamming, so even without extra skills on the wand, it was a nice boost to my damage output. So about the Necromancer class specific item, I guess I haven't really shown one for the video yet. The Necromancer can use heads in the shield slot. They are technically still shields and give you a chance to block attacks, but the biggest potential is that they can spawn with +2 Necromancer skills. I took note that I found a lot of them in Act 3, but as I was looking for one specific thing, +2 Bone Spear, most of them, or actually all of them, weren't of any use to me. As I entered Lower Kurast, I found a very good Grand Charm. Well, a pretty bad Grand Charm in general, but very good for me. +5 to Strength. And this was likely going to be the key for equipping decent gear down the road. You can find +2 strength on gear pieces too, but the amounts are pretty small until later in the game, and having to dedicate some of your gear slots to strength just to wear other gear turns into a headache of a puzzle quickly, so a few charms like this could be huge for this character. But speaking of gear with +2 strength, while still in Lower Kurast I popped a corpse on the ground and found a rare belt. 2 strength, 16 life and dual resistances, even some faster hit recovery on top. Again, just like the ring I found in Act 2, the individual values could have been higher, but a rare belt with 5 good stats? This was a great find, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if I used this all the way to hell. This turned into a bit of a loot video for a while, with the final one being this second Death Spade, which I thought was funny, so much for being unique, huh? And then I headed to Travincal, where I had to defeat the High Council for the final quest piece and to continue towards Mephisto. My fire resistance was now surprisingly high at almost 50%. which meant that I could tank some shots from the fire hydras, and while Emilio and my clay golem sacrificed themselves to create a distraction, I took the council down with my bone magic. With the final quest item from the council, I combined them all into Kalim's will and smashed the orb outside of the Jorans of Hate to open up the entrance. With Duriel fresh in my memory, I was a little bit worried about this fight beforehand, but Mephisto is not at all as relentlessly aggressive as Duriel is, so this fight ended up being a bit more of a shootout where I could try and dodge Mephisto's spells at a distance. My minions were standing up to Mephisto a lot better too compared to the Duriel fight. All things considered, a much easier fight for this character, and we took Mephisto down on the first try. The Prime Evil dropped several rares, but I had my eyes fixated on the green shield. Milabrega's Orb, a shield with 20 magic find. I would have loved to wear this for a while for more rare loot, but 47 strength was a bit too much. Actually, it was way too much considering that it would replace my Hasaurus Buckler, which contributed with 10 out of my 32 current strength. I picked up all of the rares to sell for gold, but after identifying them, it turned out that the rare light-plated boots were the real treasure. 10 additional fire and lightning resistance, as well as some poison length reduction and 23 magic find. These looked great, but again, the cool loot came with a strength requirement that I was nowhere near meeting. These went into the stash though, with hopes of someday equipping them if I could somehow muster up 50 strength. Starting out in Act 4, I found another nice looking charm just outside of town. 5 to life and a massive 24 fire resist. My inventory was already getting pretty cramped, but charms like these could go a long way towards fixing my lack of survivability. The first half of Act 4 went smoothly, with mostly slower enemies, not too many ranged monsters, and plenty of space to move around to avoid danger. I made it to the Hellforge to destroy Mephisto's Soulstone for some gems and a rune. Since I had decided to forego rune words on this run, it didn't have as big potential as usual, but there was no reason not to do it, and gems did have some potential usefulness. I was hoping for a perfect ruby, which I didn't get, but a flawless one wasn't too bad either. Then immediately after entering the sanctuary, I found a gem shrine. I used it to upgrade the flawless ruby to a perfect one, but I'll get back to this little gem later when I put it to good use. When taking down the first Seal Guardian, the Vizier of Chaos, I found a unique helm. The Coif of Glory is not a great helm by any means, but some extra lightning resistance was decent for Emilio. And then when taking down the second Seal Guardian, Lord Disease, I found another unique. This time it was the unique breastplate, Venom Ward, which has massive poison resistance as well as increases your resistance cap for poison. A bit of a one-sided item since reducing poison damage is all it does, but for a mercenary, almost completely negating poison damage can actually be pretty useful. I moved on to the third seal, hoping to score 3 for 3 on uniques from the Seal Guardians, but it was not meant to be as the Infector of Souls dropped a magic quilted armor and a rare bow. And then we went up against Diablo. The Lord of Terror took Emilio and my clay golem down very quickly. I did good damage to Diablo, but once my frontline was gone, he came rushing after me. I had to stop spear spamming and run away, but as long as I didn't just stand there and fully tank Diablo's spells, I was able to stay safe. Between bone armor and an impressive 71 fire resist, the only real danger was Diablo's lightning attack, and as a ranged spellcaster, that is not too hard to dodge. Though when it did hit me with an attack, it did hurt a lot, so I had to stay on my feet. And many bone spears and potions later, Diablo was defeated. Diablo dropped several rares, but none of them were worth talking about, and they were all just converted to gold at the vendors. And after a strong display of power in the Chaos Sanctuary, I moved on to Act 5 with confidence. I had done very little to improve my defensive situation apart from some extra plus to life gear and decent resistances, but with great damage and range, Bone Spear covered up my weaknesses for the time being, though it would not keep scaling as well as it had been forever, and the game would eventually catch up to where I had to think about surviving again, so I made sure to keep looking for upgrades where I could. Once I hit level 27, I wanted to try and improve my jewelry. I had saved up most magic rings and amulets I had found in my stash, and I cubed them together to roll new jewelry at an exchange rate of 3 to 1. The reason I hoarded them until level 27 was because that level unlocked +1 to individual skill trees on amulets cubed this way. For example, this Mentalist's Amulet of the Wolf, +1 to Shadow Disciplines for the Assassin as well as 14 extra life. I was not able to get any amulets with +1 to poison and bone spells for the Necromancer, and walked away from the cubing session with only an amulet with a little bit of magic find as well as 2 rings with faster cast speed. Those rings had potential, but at the time I found it difficult to justify using either of them over my defensive rare ring from earlier or my 10% magic find ring. I moved on through the act quickly and headed down into the ice caves in search of Anya. Act 5's Damsel in Distress, and that's when I encountered a curse which was basically the hard counter to my character for the first time. Stygian harlots and a few other similar enemies can cast a curse called Blood Mana, and when under the effects of this curse you use your life rather than your mana for casting spells. And with a character with not even 150 life that was constantly spamming spells, this was bad news. I haven't really encountered Blood Mana that many times before, because I believe they only cast it if you have more mana than life, which is a bit of an unusual situation for most characters. I never managed to completely destroy my life bulb with my own spell spam, but this was a very problematic curse for this necromancer. I needed to cast spells to defeat my enemies, so I played through these areas at a constantly very low life. I made it through all of the frozen river and rescued Anya from her frozen prison. For a reward I received a Scroll of Resistance from Mala, a free, passive boost of 10 to all my resistances. A defensive freebie like this was super helpful for someone struggling to wear gear. But you do also get a rare class-specific item as a quest reward from Anya herself. I had picked up so many Necromancer offhands by now on my way through the game, but had yet to find a single one with +2 Bone Spear. My expectations were low, but my hopes were high, and Anya seemed to be really grateful that I saved her, because she gave me this. Bloodwing, a rare preserved head with +2 to Bone Spear, exactly what I had been hoping for. The skill bonus alone would have been enough for me to wear it, but that wasn't all. This also had a high 30 lightning resist, a baby 3 to all resistances, and then some poison length reduction and faster hit recovery on top. Honestly, there was not much else I could ask for. This was definitely one of the most impactful class-specific rewards I've gotten from Anya. I put it on right away, happy to replace the Hussarus shield that I hadn't really gotten much use out of. Except I did actually rely on the 10 strength from the shield without realizing it. I was no longer strong enough to wear my rare belt, and that was a really good item for me too. As a solution for the short term, I put an amethyst in the body armor for 6 strength, and a topaz, because the loot goblin craves his loot. This was a very mediocre armor that I would need to replace eventually, but until I could find a better solution, it was definitely worth dedicating my armor slot to be able to wear my rare belt and my rare shield. With my sights set on the next difficulty, I moved through the rest of Act 5 as quickly as I could. I had a few close calls, mainly due to impatience and overconfidence, causing me to not position myself properly, but I somehow managed to narrowly escape every sticky situation I put myself into. I reached the area at Summit, where I had to defeat the ancient barbarians guarding the mountain, with them not being able to muster up enough damage to take my meat shields down. They didn't stand a chance. Whenever I was left alone and could attack freely, I dished out a lot of damage. When I was not left alone to do whatever I wanted, that's a different story for later in the video, but this fight was very one-sided. I went into the Wellstone Keep at level 30, my now level 15 Bone Spear did over 300 magic damage, which is very solid. And speaking of solid, so were my resistances, with fire being at the cap of 75 and the rest of them starting to get up there as well. And this was good, because my life total was still a very modest 152, so my life pool could really use that extra bit of protection. I reached the Throne of Destruction to face off against Bale's final guardians. A ranged attacker with high damage, such as myself, can really take advantage of the predictable nature of the wave spawning, taking the monsters down before they knew what hit them. After the first wave was defeated, I found another decent Grand Charm, Coral Grand Charm with 22 lightning resist. Very solid, and while I was hesitant to give up so much inventory space for stuff that wasn't loot, it was hard to pass up on charms like this. The rest of the waves were taken care of without too much trouble, at least until the 5th and final wave that is. Lister and the Minions of Destruction were a little tricky. I couldn't take them down fast enough, and instead they took Emilio and my clay golem down in seconds, and then I had to run away and kited them backwards towards the entrance of the area. They are kind of slow though, so by moving away and resummoning my clay golem, I could get several shots in before I had to reposition again. And before I ran out of hallway to retreat to, the last of them were defeated, and I moved on to the final boss. Bale was annoying to fight for this character. He has a mana burning attack, summons, chilling AoE knockback, and he can also cast the blood mana curse. But even with my small life pool, his damage was not quite enough. He would need a few attacks to land to really threaten me, and because of that I could counteract his damage with potions, running away and going back to town if things got too scary. Just after 3 minutes after the fight started, Bale ate his last Bone Spear and normal difficulty was defeated. The Lord of Destruction dropped 2 green pieces from the same set, and also a unique polearm, and the latter was a great find. Finding 2 pieces from the Saigon set from one boss was kind of funny, but with the set being mostly for fighting characters and having a decently high strength requirement, this wasn't loot for me, and mercenaries do not have gear slots for belts or gloves, so Emilio couldn't make use of them either. But the unique polearm on the other hand, that was certainly something that Emilio would be able to put to good use. The meat scraper, big damage, fast attack speed, a massive 10% lifesteal, 50% chance of open wounds, and the kicker, it was ethereal, which means bonus base damage with the trade-off that it can't be repaired. But since gear does not lose durability when worn by mercenaries, this was all upside, an amazing find, and it would surely turn Emilio into a force to be reckoned with. In 11 levels that is. Emilio was level 30, but the meat scraper had a level requirement of 41. Good things come to those who wait, I guess. My last order of business before I moved on to Nightmare difficulty was to socket my rare shield with a quest reward from Larsuk. It was highly unlikely that I would ever find a better necro offhand than this, so I decided to invest in it. I wanted to socket the shield with a diamond for a boost to all resistances, but as I only had diamonds of normal quality, I held off for the time being in hopes of finding a higher tier diamond later. Something I find often happens with casters especially is that once you reach Nightmare, you are around level 30, has unlocked all of your spells, and if you invested in mostly one or two of them, your spells are very strong. But since you are back in Act 1, enemies are slow and mostly melee, and there's not as many scary projectiles or spells. So the early parts of Nightmare can actually feel like a step back in difficulty, especially with a caster as I mentioned, before picking up again in the later acts. So I made sure to enjoy it, because once those scary damage types started picking up again, my low life would become a real problem. I started testing out Bone Spirit, a level 30 skill that trades Bone Spear's piercing ability and speed for higher single target damage that seeks out your target. At the time I only spent the 1 point to try it out, and favored maxing out Bone Spirit first, but this could be a decent addition for bosses and stronger elites later. Passing the Forgotten Tower, I thought about all of the strong rune words I could have gotten, and with the runes available at the Nightmare Countess, there really were some strong ones that I could have made already. Well, I moved past it, but now the decision to skip rune words for this character was really starting to have a noticeable impact, both for me and for Emilio. With the absence of those strong rune words, I decided to try and craft a decent piece of gear for Emilio instead. A helm, together with a perfect ruby, a rail rune and a jewel in the cube, creates a blood-crafted helm. A helm with guaranteed lifesteal, life and deadly strike. And I got a little bit of extra resistance on top as well. The individual stat rolls were rather low, but still a nice boost for my struggling mercenary. I pushed on through Act 1 and made quick progress without too much trouble, though towards the end of the act I started having some very close calls, like against this lightning enchanted spider. Scary stuff, but I was getting used to any elemental damage being potentially fatal at this point. I made it through to Andariel, and since Emilio had Venom Ward, I was hoping that he would stand up to Andariel if I gave him some potions. But that wasn't the case at all. Though I will say that despite that, Andariel was not the most difficult, as I kited her around the hole in the floor and dodged most of their poison sprays. And while I have been complaining about my survivability, my damage was still very solid. Going into the second act, I was level 36, with a very modest 161 life. My character's green numbers did not grow much, apart from my damage and mainly my mana total, and I had to lean into being a glass cannon harder and harder. Emilio was still waiting for his nice stick from normal Bale, but in the meantime I found a rare pike that was an upgrade. Honestly, when I went to compare, I could barely believe that Emilio was still wearing that stinky old magic spear from Act 2 normal, and while this rare pike was actually not very good at all, it was certainly better. I stuck to the outer edges of the areas in the desert as much as possible, partially to skip some fighting in Act 2, but also to ensure that I wasn't surrounded from all directions at once. On a side note, towards the end of my desert adventures, I learned that fire towers are extremely magic resistant. Not that it really matters, since they can't chase you if you simply run away, but looking up their stats, I found it quite interesting that I have 90 magic resistance in Nightmare. Seems a little bit random. I soon found myself in Tal Rasha's tomb. It wasn't that I was actually speeding through the act or anything, but there was a lot more to cover, and Nightmare sometimes feels like a weird limbo between starting the run in normal and the true challenges in hell, so I'm just covering the highlights. Like this rare amulet. At first glance the +1 to assassin skills looked like a miss, but inspecting the other stats a bit more closely, a massive boost to fire resist and 15 to strength, even some tiny damage reduction on top. A serious upgrade to what I was wearing before. I put it on and was happy with a decent upgrade, but I didn't fully appreciate how big of a deal 15 strength on the amulet slot was yet. It really was the perfect item for exactly this character, and the amulet doesn't have any stat requirements on its own, so it was the perfect base item to boost my strength. My minion stood up surprisingly well against Duriel, and I did decent work to his health bar before they eventually fell. This prompted me to run around rather than attacking, but in hindsight it was a fortunate incident, because that prompted me to remember about Bone Wall again, which I had for some reason forgotten about, and Bone Wall would prove to be invaluable going forward. After taking down a trapped Duriel, I got some cool loot drops, surprisingly so even, considering it was Duriel. Before I left for Act 3, I swapped Emilio for one with the Holy Freeze aura over Prayer. I do love the passive healing from Prayer for convenience, but I felt like I needed that extra bit of crowd control, especially as the crowds that I would face in the jungle would be pretty big. Emilio finally hit level 41 as we were about to leave the jungle, which meant that he could finally equip the Ethereal Meat Scraper from normal Bale. A very nice upgrade. The damage numbers didn't look too impressive to be honest, but with fast hitting attacks, lots of lifesteal and some open wounds, Emilio would be a force to be reckoned with. And then when returning the Gidbin to Ormus, I got a decent rare ring, 10 FCR, 23 cold resist, some baby damage reduction and some more energy. Not amazing for a rare, but I was happy to take an FCR ring with some resist. I was experiencing some major indecisions with this character. I did not know what I wanted to focus on with my build next. I considered investing more in minions, maybe finally getting some curses, or even more points into Bone Wall and Bone Armor. In the end, I decided to go for Bone Spirit after maxing out Bone Spear as a complementary attack against single targets. That was surely nice to have, but in hindsight I think it was a mistake to ignore my glaring weaknesses in favor of even more damage, especially considering that act bosses had not been the main problem for a while. Oh well, that is easy to say with the power of hindsight. Though shortly after, I did find a very nice charm to help me with some of my defensive power while also helping me equip my gear. A grand charm with +5 to strength and 29 lightning resistance. An absolutely perfect find for this necromancer. But despite my weaknesses, I made it through Act 3 cleanly, until I hit Travancal that is. The High Council was a rude awakening. Not that I was surprised that they were strong, but so far in Nightmare I had looked at my stats and thought, uh-oh, I'm very fragile, but I'd been able to just push through anyway. But the council members really exposed my weaknesses for what they really were. Incoming elemental damage really ramped up in this fight, and my damage, which was my main strength, seemed to start falling off. It's not the worst damage I have dealt by some margin, but considering that this was in Nightmare and that I had spent almost all of my stat points into making bone spells stronger, I was expecting more. My minions fell, my bone walls fell, and they really put the pressure on me constantly as I desperately tried to kite my way backwards. I ended up dying once, but I eventually managed to take them down, so it was not a hard wall or anything, but it was a taste of the struggles ahead. Because even with very solid fire and lightning resistances for this fight, if my minions and walls could not tank for me, I had nothing to keep me safe. The rest of the way to Mephisto was alright, except that time when Emilio killed me. Okay, maybe it's unfair to blame Emilio for this since I was running ahead a bit too aggressively and I also didn't have bone armor up for some reason. But the cause of death was that Emilio was killing an exploding doll right next to me, so I decided to point fingers instead of owning up to my mistakes. I also found my third flawless diamond in the Endurance of Fate, which meant that I could finally cube up to a perfect one to put in my shield, for a nice boost of 19 to all resistances. This shield was really coming together to a very solid item. And then I also found Goblin Toe, a unique pair of boots with 25% crushing blow. This is the kind of item I am always secretly hoping for when I do my runs with barbarians or paladins, but one that I don't think I have ever found on a challenge run before. First the Steel Driver from Duriel and now this. What a shame to have this loot on a Necromancer run. Before long I reached Mephisto, and seeing how troublesome elemental damage was becoming, I felt no shame in cheesing Mephisto over the moat with my homing Bone Spirits. My Bone Spirit damage was now on par with my Bone Spear, and while it cost more mana, the target seeking ability made sure that all my spells hit. And after a continuous barrage of Bone Spirits took Mephisto down without having been able to fight back, I moved on to Act 4. Continuing the arc of scary elemental damage, I got souls in the Plains of Despair. Fortunately, my lightning resist was at the cap of 75 now, so I could take the odd stray hit, but I was absolutely not able to just stand there and tank, so the Plains of Despair turned into a long grind of dodging, spamming bone spells in their general direction and then retreating whenever my life got uncomfortably low. Though I found Isuel rather isolated, and with Holy Freeze and lots of lifesteal from the Meat Scraper, Emilio could stand his ground against a single foe, so I made sure to grind Isuel down for the 2 skill points. Back in town, as I was getting close to the Chaos Sanctuary, I identified a large charm with 20 to life. and I just took note of how funny and or sad it was that a large charm like this felt like a sweet drop at this point in the game, boosting my life total by almost 10% on its own. I was expecting lots of trouble in Act 4, but in the River of Flame and then the Chaos Sanctuary itself, Bone Wall was highly effective in the narrow terrain. This was now a core part of my battle plan, trying to completely seal off enemies behind several layers of walls and then shoot them down from the other side. A bit of an annoying downside with Bone Wall was that they persist for a long time, and I couldn't destroy or unsummon my own walls in any way, but standing around and waiting for a short while after every encounter was a cheap price to pay for how much this tactic tilted the fighting in my favor. Even the Seal Guardians were locked down with Bone Wall and had to just sit and stare at me as I took them out with a steady stream of bone spells. Well, again, it worked until it didn't. Much like the High Council of Travancore, the Infector of Souls and his crew could tear down my walls too quickly for me to keep up, and with them being extra fast, they closed the distance quickly and I soon found myself cornered, but just in the nick of time I managed to take Infector of Souls down, and since he was the final Seal Guardian, the rest of them exploded. Phew, close call. And then it was time for Diablo, and with my new and improved bone magic I could stay at a really long range from him to make dodging easier, allowing me to focus on staying alive while trusting that I made progress on his health bar thanks to my homing spirits. I was pleasantly surprised with how clean and consistent this fight was, even though it was a bit of a grind. I was not impressed with the damage I was dealing, but it was serviceable, and eventually he ate his last bone spirit and I stood victorious. Diablo dropped some interesting loot. First, the Face of Horror, an interesting item with a whopping 20 strength and 10 to all resistances. Not an item which I usually raise my eyebrows at, but maybe this was the run where it would finally shine, so I saved that one in the stash for later. He also dropped Milabrega's shield again, and while I was much closer to the requirement now, actually with the Face of Horror I could have worn it, but my rare Necro shield was so strong that not even Magic Find could tempt me to replace it. Pushing on through Act 5 towards the final difficulty, I was brainstorming some build improvement ideas and trying to form a plan. I felt like my character needed something, but I couldn't quite figure out what my best course of action was. So I decided to finish the rest of Nightmare and then wait and see if I got any epiphanies when I entered Hell. I was now extremely reliant on Bone Wall, using it for every single encounter unless I was trying to run past something. And that was highly effective, but leaning so heavily on it also made the exceptions very prominent. Some enemy projectiles can pass through the wall much like my own spells, some enemies could take them down quickly, and in the ice caves I learned that the ghost type enemies can simply walk through them. Lore accurate I guess, but an unpleasant surprise for me. Still, I wasn't complaining, because Bone Wall was absolutely carrying me when it came to survivability. I reached the Ariat Summit and the Ancients, and this is another encounter where Bone Wall was merely great, not completely unfair. One of them can simply jump over it, and another can whirlwind through it. It still took Madoc out of the equation completely, and even though it didn't completely lock the other two down, it did mess with them, giving me ample time to wear them down with my spells. All in all, not a very troublesome fight. I actually expected much worse. And to celebrate, and perhaps as a sign that I was somehow getting a bit cocky as I approached Hell, I ended the fight by seeing how many walls I could cover Madoc in before I took him out. Well, overconfidence and all, I did die once in the Wellstone Keep, and it was a very surprising death to me in the moment, because those kamikaze grunts are usually not that deadly. I sat in shock, staring at the death screen for a while, but when reviewing the footage, it was an elite pack that was extra fast and cold enchanted. They rushed me before I could react, with the minions taking some chip damage out of my health pool, and then when the pack leader exploded, it was actually his Frost Nova explosion that killed me, a rare and very deadly combo on that particular enemy. I guess in the bigger perspective, it was good to get a reality check before I entered Hell, and for the rest of Nightmare I played very carefully and patiently. I took all of Bale's minions down with Bone Wall cheese tactics, which was extremely effective since I could start setting up the walls in between the rounds so that they were stuck from the start. And then it was time for Bale, and he was tough. Bone Wall still helped out, but between his Blood Mana curse and being able to cast spells both past and through my walls, it was a very intense fight. I tried my best to use the environment to my advantage and played very defensively, but it was basically impossible to avoid damage in this fight. I spent most of the time babysitting my life pool, sitting at a constantly low life, and trusted that my bone magic chipped away at his, once again making good use out of the homing property of Bone Spirit. and after many trips to town and a lot of potions consumed, I was able to steal a W against the Lord of Destruction, but that was a messy brawl. I honestly feel like I'm underselling the struggle against Nightmare Bale with how briefly I'm covering it, but I guess I will have plenty of more opportunities to complain about Bale later. I didn't get any interesting drops from him this time around, but with this victory I defeated Nightmare difficulty and moved on to Hell, with lacking confidence. I entered Hell at level 55, my once very solid resistances weren't looking so hot anymore with the -100 modifier from Hell difficulty. I now had over 300 energy but a very modest 239 life. Yes, that's right, not only was my mana higher than my life, but now even my energy stat was higher than my life total. For reference, when I played my Runewords only paladin from the last video, a character with a very normal stat build, he had 280 life when he left Act 1, in normal difficulty, and here I was in Hell with 239. My first few steps into Hell were looking promising though, with Bone Wall doing Bone Wall things and my damage taking down early enemies quickly. But that was the thing though, early enemies are slow and easy to trap, and as soon as I encountered some faster enemies, the margin of error became very small. If I let a single enemy through, I was in trouble, and with such a high level disparity to enemies in Hell, my minions didn't stand a chance either. I was considering going back to farming in Nightmare to power up, but for the time being I decided to make some gear upgrades first. And there really were some low-hanging fruit in that regard, as a lot of my gear was still items with basically only magic find and very few other stats. First I shopped for another wand and I finally found a solid one at a bargain price, +2 to all necromancer skills for only 58k. I guess what makes some wands really expensive is the inherent plus to individual necro skills, but a magic prefix like this was of course a big boost and at a very affordable price, an absolute steal. Then I replaced my 18 magic find helm. Yes, I was also surprised that I was still using this when starting Hell, and equipped the Face of Horror, and with that strength boost from my new helm I was also able to finally equip the rare boots from earlier that I had saved in my stash for a long time. A solid pair of boots, though 10 to fire and lightning resistance wasn't that big of a deal anymore, still an upgrade over my old ones in every regard. I also had to do something about my armor, not needing that puny strength boost anymore when wearing the Face of Horror. It really was a terrible item choice, but I wasn't sure what to go for instead. If I had not banned Runewords, a stealth armor would have been great, but this time I instead browsed the vendor's goods for sale and ended up buying this, a mechanics light plate of the Tiger, with one open socket and a bit of life. A single socket and 27 life was pretty mediocre compared to what was possible on a body armor, but I decided it was good enough for the time being and put a ruby in the socket for even more life. 297 life now, not as bad as before. I did the Den of Evil for another skill point, and now I had 3 to spare after having maxed out Bone Spirit at the end of Nightmare, and this was when I finally got around to getting a curse, and put those points into getting Attract, a curse which marks an enemy and causes nearby enemies to attack it. A low-level Attract does not last very long at all unfortunately, but it did definitely help, especially against fast enemies or when I messed up my bone walls. A few casts of Attract could buy me a few seconds to reposition myself and respam my bone walls. It was a fragile battle plan, but at least it was a plan, and when it worked as intended, it was actually pretty great, and I pushed on towards Andariel. And as I got used to the playstyle, my confidence grew, though a lot of fights were now extremely grindy and progress slow. When I reached Andariel, I was surprised by a very easy boss fight. I was worried that Andariel would take all of my walls down in no time, but while she was tearing them down, she wasn't doing it as fast as I could summon them, and to my delight, I could reliably trap her and grind her down safely. I found myself in a very unfamiliar situation, where an act boss in Hell felt almost trivial. When doing my challenge runs with low-powered characters, I often end up relying heavily on crowd control for progress in Hell, but usually those spells don't work against act bosses at all. This felt weird, unusual, but certainly welcome. Elemental damage kept being the bane of my existence in Act 2, and here's a pretty funny death. I was fighting an elite maggot in the far oasis, and as they often do, it buried when it got down to low light. I did not see the cold enchanted stat, as my mind was so focused on it being cursed and lightning enchanted. And then when it resurfaced and immediately died, it exploded in my face and the cold damage took me out. Almost like a living landmine. Pretty sneaky, I give them that. The narrow indoor areas of the act once again proved very abusable, and this was also when I finally started using Corpse Explosion. It is a great skill, honestly it might be the best necro skill there is. but at low levels the range is very small, so I hadn't found much use for it when I tried it earlier. When I can, I usually put a decent amount of skill points into this skill just to increase the range, but I felt that my skill points were stretched very thin on this character. Despite there being great crossover synergies between my offensive and my defensive bone magic, I still felt like I needed to invest more points into bone spear and bone spirit damage, more points into a stronger bone wall and bone armor, I wanted more points into curses for more and longer crowd control, and I also wanted more and stronger summons. There were simply too many good skills and too few skill points. And I guess that's my long-winded way of saying that I didn't put more points into Corpse Explosion, despite it being an amazing skill. But I pulled it out whenever I fought in a very narrow place, like doors. Another issue I haven't really talked about before were completely magic immune enemies. There were also magic immune mummies in all of the tombs, but I found that for those I could grind their minions down and then Emilio could take them on one-on-one. To be honest, I was a little bit disappointed in Emilio's damage with a solid, ethereal polearm, but I guess that the meat scraper, while very decent, just doesn't have the base damage to really shine in the late game. Towards the end of Act 2, I did spend one more point into the curse tree and got amplified damage. I skilled this purely as a way to help Emilio deal with magic immune enemies faster, and it did make a difference. A bit of a niche use case perhaps, but on the other hand it was a single skill point, and I was very happy with the investment. Because while magic immune enemies aren't very common in the grand scheme of things, in Tal Rasha's tomb there were so many mummies. Once I reached Duriel, I had another easy boss fight compared to the struggles that I had to face to get there. For some reason, this time Duriel completely freaked out and didn't attack my walls, instead trying to go after me and my minions, causing him to be stuck and wiggle back and forth in place. When he finally snapped out of it and started working on my walls, there was already a thick barricade between me and him, and he simply didn't have time to close the distance before I took him down. I kept up my cautious playstyle in Act 3 with great success, but I started dying every now and then. The flayers were fast and small and could slip through cracks in my walls, but I was also getting a bit bored and lost focus at this point. In this clip, a few enemies sneak up on me, but I just sat there and kept attacking some other enemies outside of the walls. And looking back, I definitely had time to run away and reposition myself before they got me. Just lazy and sloppy play, but I kept at it, grinding my way through the jungle. Until I ran into a serious problem. I ran out of money completely. I strictly didn't need Emilio right now, but I needed potions. And since I was feeling some progress fatigue anyway, I thought it would be a nice break to go back and farm for gold. Though before that, I grabbed the Jade figurine for my third and final potion of life. The 60 life in total I had gotten from this quest accounted for almost 20% of my current max life. Pretty crazy when you think about it. At first I planned to go back to Nightmare for easier enemies, but then I thought about how easily I'd been able to handle Act bosses, so I tried doing a few Andariel runs in Hell instead, hoping for some sweet loot drops in addition to the gold I needed. I completed a handful of runs, selling most valuables I found from her. The runs weren't fast by any means, but they were rather safe. I did end up finding a nice pair of rare boots though, with more resistances and more importantly, finally some run speed. Honestly, these boots were pretty damn sweet. And the additional movement speed really made a big difference, not only because moving faster is convenient and simply feels good, but it also made repositioning myself as well as running away from danger much faster. I also found a unique Gothic plate, Rattle Cage, a good damage boost for Emilio thanks to the crushing blow, although no defensive stats were a little bit iffy since he had trouble staying alive. I did find a lot of gold. He sold me this armor with 70 life and 38 mana. Not amazing, but still an upgrade over my old one, and I decided to go back to Larsuk in Nightmare and socket it before I continued my questing. Magic items can actually get 1 or 2 sockets from Larsuk, but I did not get lucky this time. Still, with a perfect ruby in that socket, this armor granted me over 100 extra life, which was certainly a nice boost. I took a short break from this character after the grind, and when I picked it back up, I continued my questing through Hell. But it wouldn't be long before I had to go back for another grinding session. Simply put, I was too underleveled. The High Council wasn't as big of a problem this time as they were in Nightmare, but many random elites made my progress rough and costly. Towards the end of the act, I ran out of gold for Emilio again, and soon I didn't even have enough gold for more potions. As I was close to Mephisto, I tried running through to see if I could perhaps cheese him over the moat without alerting other enemies. That did not work out as planned, and after an extremely messy attempt where I tried fighting Mephisto alongside with several other enemies nearby, I once again died to a cold enchanted explosion. This on-death Frost Nova was really the bane of this character. After that defeat, I admitted that I had to go back and grind for more power and gold before I continued through hell. And this time I was gonna do a proper grind. After selling some of my gems to afford one more Emilio resurrection, I did a mix of Hell Andariel runs and some high level terror zones in Nightmare for experience, and of course gold, but not that much in the way of loot. Though I did find a decent pair of gloves with some much needed resistances, replacing my old Magic Find and Fire Resist gloves that I had worn since Act 2 of Normal. I spent several hours on this grind, and sadly, the gloves was pretty much it in terms of noteworthy loot, but I did get a lot of experience and gold. I returned to Act 3 Hell at level 74, with both me and Emilio being noticeably stronger. I had really hoped for more loot upgrades, but honestly, my gear was pretty alright. Only a bit light on +2 skills and cast speed, and of course having some gear slots dedicated to +2 strength wasn't ideal. I had invested the extra skill points into maxing out Bone Wall, and then some more points into Attract for a longer duration. Attract is often considered a one-point wonder, but during the grind I really felt the difference in having that curse last slightly longer, and I really liked it. I'm not sure if it was the extra levels, the extra bit of resistances, or if the farming detour simply reset my patience and appetite for the grind, maybe a mix of all three, but when I returned to the Endurance of Fate for round 2 against Mephisto, everything went a lot smoother than before. Mephisto surprised me by attacking me in one of the side rooms, where usually he doesn't come at you until you're much closer to his spawn location. And I noticed this happening a few times during this playthrough, and I guessed that either Bone Wall or Attract drew the attention of enemies from much further away than usual. Anyway, this time I managed to isolate Mephisto after clearing out his bodyguards in a timely manner, and I took the Lord of Hatred down fairly easily. I once again ran into souls in Act 4, and in Hell they can be a huge roadblock. But now having almost 400 life and maxed lightning resistance, I found that I could fight them surprisingly well. Again, that meant being able to soak up a couple of hits without insta-dying, not standing around and tank them, and definitely not just running past them. Sticking close to the edge of the map and any choke points in the terrain, I was able to grind my way through, but Act 4 was a real patience tester. I found that the key to success in the later parts of Hell was ultimately not about even more grinding or even better gear. It was taking periodic breaks to keep my patience and focus up. When I played well and followed the plan, progress was steady, but when I started getting impatient and reached a little too far, I was quickly punished. This character is not the first super fragile character that I have played through Hell, but it was for some reason the one I had died with the most. And I honestly don't think it was the character's fault, but my own. Maybe this playthrough had dragged on for a bit too long, even for my taste. Maybe it was built up frustration from the bone spells underperforming my expectations. Maybe a no vitality necromancer was a tougher challenge than I thought it would be. Or maybe I was simply not playing the character very well, being used to relying on a small army of skeletons by my side on my usual necromancers. I persevered, but I was not happy with my own performance during this part. On paper, this necromancer had all the tools required to tackle basically anything Hell threw at him. I guess sometimes you just play worse than other times. Though once again, and to add a bit of foreshadowing, for the final time in this playthrough, the Act boss was among the easiest parts of the Act. Bone Wall, Bone Spirit, and dodging his lightning beam. You know the drill by now. Diablo dropped a pile of rare gear, but nothing that I wanted to use over my current loadout, though those light-plated boots were pretty nice. I leveled up when taking down Diablo, and when I started Act 5 I reached the milestone of over 1000 mana. That's not something you see every day. The final act of Hell was one of high contrast in difficulty. The end would put me in some of the hardest fights I've had in a long time, but the early parts were a breeze. I used my final socketing quest on Emilio's rattle cage and put an Ort rune into it for 30 extra lightning resist, anticipating that if the Worldstone Keep spawned with souls, I would be in trouble, and boy was I right. But first I had to take on the barbarians guarding the entrance. My first attempt was actually a failure, but not for the reason you might expect. Talik was extra fast, and that can be very dangerous since it makes it a lot more likely that he catches you with Whirlwind. But the main reason for the reset was that I forgot to stock up on potions completely before the fight. And I don't mean extra potions, I had not even filled my belt up. Whoops. A very cheap mistake to make, as it only cost a town portal and some gold to fix. Just a tie-in to me not playing at my best during this. On the second attempt I covered the arena in bone walls before I summoned them. Emilio fell pretty early in the fight, but he bought me enough time to set myself up in a good position and get some early damage in. and from that point I could finish them off one by one. Though I had a really close call when I was once again hit with a cold enchanted explosion when I took Talik down. I was barely able to survive the hit, but I did survive and sealed my victory over the Ancients. I continued into the Worldstone Keep, and as I hinted earlier, I ran into a lot of souls on the second level, which caused me a lot of trouble. Emilio didn't last very long at all. The added lightning resist from the Orc rune was not nearly enough to keep him alive. I took down a few souls that wandered away from the main pack to my position, but eventually I had to engage an elite pack of souls around the corner. Despite maxed lightning resistance, I was simply not able to deal with their high damage, fast moving lightning beams from off screen in a good way. It started out looking decent, but eventually I found myself in an awkward position with low life and not quite knowing where the souls had moved to. I greedily opted for a health potion instead of a full rejuve, thinking I was safe, but before I had time to react, I was sniped. No problem, I had secured the waypoint and cleared out all the other enemies I encountered on the way to the soul pack. But while I was able to soak up some damage with maxed lightning resistance, without my gear on, I was instantly one-shot. I died several times here, but with every reincarnation I made some progress, and eventually I was able to get my body back and take the souls down. This didn't feel great, but I was now so close to the end that I didn't think too much about it and instead focused on pushing towards Bale. I actually encountered another elite soul on the same level at the very end before the stairs, but not wanting to risk getting stuck in another death loop, I summoned my clay golem and just after the soul fired its first shot, I ran straight for the stairs. I was blessed with a lack of souls on level 3 and the throne room level, and soon I triggered Bale's waves of minions for the final time. Bonewall once again made this very favorable for me, making most of the waves very easy, though the second wave did pose a problem. A group of elite magic immune mummies. First I had to grind the skeleton mages down and quickly blow them up with corpse explosion to avoid their perpetual resurrection. And once all the skeletons were cleared, I had to revive Emilio to take down the mummies for me. Unfortunately, he was in no shape to take them all on at once, so I had to trap Emilio and just one or two mummies alone in a pocket of bone walls, while zoning out the rest of them. This fight took a really long time, since if I made a mistake and trapped Emilio alone, I had to sit around and wait for the walls to fall down naturally, but it was a winning strategy in the end. And then the rest of the waves were easy and straightforward in comparison. Even Lister and his crew couldn't muster up enough power to take down my wall spam. But then I was ready to take on Bale. Sometimes the real challenge is getting to Bale in hell, but then the boss himself is just a slow but safe grind. But for this character, that was not the case at all. This Bale fight turned out to be one of the most difficult ones I have ever had. So why was that? Well, he still had the blood mana curse, which made sure I was constantly dealing damage to myself. But then because I was so fragile with my tiny life pool, and because my defensive stats did not align very well with his damage types, almost every one of Bale's spells were deadly to me. His large AoE cold wave pierced my bone walls and dealt heavy damage to me. His tentacle summons, which are usually annoying more than anything, slapped me for scary amounts of damage. And whenever Bale summoned his clone and doubled up on the amount of spells, I didn't stand a chance. Okay, I guess his mana burn spell wasn't that dangerous, but that's mostly because I didn't dare to go closer than half a screen away from him. This fight was a marathon of endurance. I chipped away at Bale, a sliver of his health bar at a time, while he threatened lethal damage with every one of his attacks, especially his cold wave. I died a lot in this fight. The margin of error had simply grown too small for me to handle over this long and grindy of a fight. To be honest, at the end of it all, I kind of admit defeat. I should have been able to make this character work, but I never fully got there. I did achieve my goal of defeating Hell Bale in the end after a super intense battle, clocking in at just under 20 minutes of real time. But I didn't feel like I truly beat him. I simply died enough times that eventually the chip damage added up to a victory, and that was simply bittersweet. Well, I don't want to end on a bit of a downer comment. I did enjoy the majority of this playthrough, especially the early parts. Hindsight is 20/20, but I just think I could have done the second half of Hell differently. Oh well, another stat-only character in the books, marking the final part of this series of runs. But on a brighter note, I got some very nice loot from Bale after such a struggle of a fight. I'm not talking about this unique Necromancer wand, which would have been amazing for this character had he found it earlier. I mean skills, FCR and almost 100 life. Where was that a few acts ago? I'm also not talking about Cold Kill, the unique hatchet with some very unique stats. I'm talking about the unique Spired Helm, which turned out to be a decently rolled Nightwing's Veil, an extremely powerful and decently rare helm for characters built around cold damage. A very sweet find to end this adventure. I ended the run at level 76, not being that much higher than after the grinding session I did in Act 3. I simply died a lot and lost experience over the course of the last 2 acts. I did decent damage, though as I mentioned a few times already, a bit disappointing. 15 vitality, never quite breaking the 400 life barrier, 427 energy and 1017 mana, and good, but uneven, resistances. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to boot.dev for sponsoring. If you wanna check it out, I have links in the description and the pinned comment. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video.